Hello, everyone. Thank you for being on today and being a participant of our next webinar. My name is Annie Randolph, and I'm a resource facilitator with the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa. As you will see on your GoToWebinar control panel, you have two options for listening today, mic and speakers or telephone. So if you're having any issues with either of those, go ahead and put a question into the question box, and I will help kind of facilitate any sort of technical assistance you need during that. We will be recording this webinar today, and it'll be archived on our Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa website in the coming days. And that web address is biaia.org. Also, we'll save a few minutes at the end of the session for any questions you might have for Dave. So please utilize the question box for this on your control panel. Also, no CEUs will be provided for this webinar, but a certificate of attendance will be sent to all attendees following the session through your email. Also, we have attached PowerPoints for this webinar in the handouts portion of your control panel, so please feel free to print those off and write notes on those if you would like. Now I will go ahead and introduce our guest speaker today. Dave Anders is an Iowa licensed speech and language pathologist who has been practicing in the field of brain injury for 18 years and currently holds the position of therapy director at On With Life. Dave is a member of the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa Board of Directors and received certification as a brain injury specialist trainer through the Brain Injury Association of America in 2012. He has presented regionally and nationally on a variety of topics related to acquired brain injury. So thank you all for participating, and I will go ahead and let Dave get started.
All right. Again, thank you for attending, and hopefully you'll find the topic interesting and helpful today. A quick nod to the Brain Injury Alliance. If you heard my last webinar on cognition, one of the things that I said at the beginning was that I had the good fortune for about 10 years to facilitate the support group for the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa here in the central Iowa region. And, while my background as a speech language pathologist is certainly helpful in talking about this topic, having that real life experience and working with survivors who, ranged from a few months post-injury to 20, 30 years post-injury, really gave me a much more comprehensive understanding of the real life issues that come along with brain injury. So a lot of this the things I'm going to talk about come from my experience and the knowledge that I gained through the privilege of getting to facilitate that support group. So thank you to the Alliance. All right, let's see. And how do I move forward? There it is. Which one was it? The down? All right. Sorry about that. So let's talk a little bit about anger in general. Again, the topic of the webinar is anger after brain injury. And so I want to start by talking about anger, not just in survivors of brain injury, but anger in all of us, and how does that work, and what's going on in your brain that causes this emotion to happen. And at a very basic level, anger starts with your amygdala. You have two amygdala, and they're almond-shaped structures, and they sit kind of anterior to your hippocampus. They're part of your limbic system. And I'll get into more about, kind of the function of the limbic system here after a bit. But, essentially the responsibility, one of the responsibilities of the amygdala are to kind of scan your experience and gauge that experience for emotional content. And then essentially what the amygdala do is they decide which track they're going to send that experience down. And you have two options. Your first option, the most common option, is to send that experience as you go through life, as you go through your life's experience. They send that experience to your cortex, and the cortex we'll talk about here in just a minute as well, what happens there. But then the other track actually bypasses the cortex and sends your experience straight to the limbic system. And this is at a basic level where anger comes from. Just a couple of quick kind of side notes about the amygdala, kind of interesting stuff about the amygdala. All of your body's senses, so vision, touch, auditory, are routed, kind of filtered through your thalamus. There is one sense that is not filtered through your thalamus, and that's the sense of smell. Your sense of smell goes straight to your amygdala, which is one of the reasons why you can have emotional kinds of memories or emotional kind of tags to smells. The other day, just as an example, some folks at work were working with Play-Doh. We had Play-Doh out, and they were using Play-Doh instead of Theraputty in order to work with somebody on manual dexterity. And just the smell, I happened to walk into the session, and the smell of that Play-Doh actually immediately took me back to Mrs. Hyland's kindergarten class. And that's because of, that smell was routed straight to my amygdala and associated with an early emotion. The amygdala are also very, very important in memory. When you talk about emotional memory, just as an example, if any of you are old enough to remember the Twin Towers, I assume many of you are old enough to remember the Twin Towers being hit. And you can probably call up that memory, and that memory is very, very vivid. You can probably remember exactly where you were, the context of what was happening when all of that, when you saw it on the news and the information started coming in about those Twin Towers being attacked. You probably have a very vivid memory of that time. And that's because your amygdala were essentially causing your hippocampus, which is highly involved in memory. There's a protein that's produced that solidifies memory more securely and more completely when there's an emotional tag that goes with it. So you've got this very detailed memory about that experience, whereas you probably have no idea what you were doing at the same time the day before. It's because of the function of the amygdala. All right, so let's get back to the talk, and let's talk about the two tracks, these two options that the amygdala can send your experience down. The first one, of course, is to the cortex. It's where most of our experience goes, and that allows us to engage the thinking brain. We can take our experience and we can reason and we can problem solve and we can be creative and we can use judgments, because that's, essentially the frontal lobes, the prefrontal cortex, are responsible for that. Your frontal lobes also have an additional responsibility and more directly related to anger and emotion, and that is, I have this kind of odd little picture on the screen of a thermostat. So when I'm explaining emotion and emotional dysregulation with survivors and families, the analogy that I tend to use is that your frontal lobes act like the thermostat that go with the heater in your house. So your limbic system is like the heater. Your limbic system is where the physical manifestation, the chemical manifestations of anger come from. Your limbic system kicks out anger in the same way as your heater kicks out heat in your house. Now, your frontal lobes, your cortex, acts as the thermostat to adjust the level of heat in the house, or the level of anger that the limbic system is kicking out. So just as an example, I have a 12-year-old boy, and his name is Blake. And Blake angers me on a fairly regular basis just by doing 12-year-old boy kinds of things. And as an example, last fall after, working in brain injury, I had put off the trampoline thing for years and years. The kids had both been asking for a trampoline for a number of years. I'd successfully put it off, and last fall I finally caved and bought the trampoline. And about 2 weeks after we'd purchased the trampoline, I happened to walk out onto our back deck just in time to see that Blake had moved the trampoline from its usual place in the backyard next to our garden shed. And Blake was standing on the garden shed getting ready to jump into the trampoline. And my heater kicked on. It's my limbic system scanned that experience, or my amygdala scanned that experience and sent it straight to the limbic system. I felt myself get angry. And I was able to, in that moment, stop myself, take a deep breath, count to 10, think about the situation. He's 12. I probably would have done the same thing when I was 12. So I then, of course, talked him off the roof of the garden shed, explained what, we talked about consequences and what might have happened, and kind of worked through the situation. And that process that I was using my cortex, my frontal lobes to complete, I'm using, essentially all of that was using logic and problem solving and reasoning. That actually caused my anger to abate. It caused my anger to, it didn't completely go away, but it didn't rage out of control. And I was much better equipped to handle that situation because I had access to my frontal lobes to go through that thought process and turn down the heater. So, as we kind of go through this presentation and are thinking about the role, the role of the amygdala, the role of the limbic system, and the role of the frontal lobes, you start to understand why this is such a challenge with our brain injury survivors. In traumatic brain injury, the single most often injured area of the brain is the frontal lobes, the very area that I was using to process and work my way through that situation with Blake and handle that without getting incredibly angry and not managing the situation well. So it gives you just a little bit of insight right there into some of the challenges that our survivors have when they don't have, when those frontal lobes have been injured, and that you lose access to reasoning, problem solving, judgment, especially when the limbic system tends to want to, or the amygdala tend to want to send that experience to the limbic system in the first place. All right, so that's track one, where the amygdala sends the experience down track one to the cortex, and we can think about it, and we can problem solve, and we can reason, and we can work our way through that experience with some degree of success. Track two is a completely different story. Track two, essentially, if the experience that we're having is emotionally loaded enough, the amygdala are going to send that experience down a second track. And that second track is straight into the limbic system, kind of the heater. And lots and lots of things happen when that experience heads down that second track. First and foremost, it bypasses the cortex. So you tend to lose access to the thinking brain. You are in fight or flight response. So your brain is preparing your body for either fighting or flying or running away. And here's the basic process that happens. You have a combination of hormones and neurotransmitters, catecholamines, are released, and that causes you to have this burst of energy. These neurotransmitters also cause you to have this angry desire. You want to immediately do something. I want to fight. I need to do something to address this. Your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure rises, your face flushes because you've got blood rushing to your extremities. Your attention narrows. You tend to focus on what is the focus of your anger, and I'm gonna narrow my attention on that focus of my anger. And then you have additional chemicals that are released, adrenaline, noradrenaline, which cause this kind of combination of symptoms to persist. Most of us, when we have this situation come up, tend to start to calm and tend to start to regain access to the cortex within about 20 minutes. You've got these chemicals, these hormones going in your brain that if you try to, if another situation comes up, you're much more immediately going to head into the limbic system and restart this anger process just because of the chemicals that are going through your brain. So most of us, after about 20 minutes, that's when we can, we start to calm, we can think more logically about the situation, and go a different direction. So that's track 2. There we go. So how does at this, when we're just talking about track 1 and track 2, what happens in brain injury? Number 1 is that the switch tends to more easily engage the limbic system. You also now, as I alluded to earlier, you now have a cortex that doesn't exactly do its job the way it did before. Those processes of reasoning and problem solving and judgment, those things that turn down the thermostat, those processes that turn down the thermostat aren't working the way they did before. So you now have low frustration tolerance. You have a switch that stays tripped. You're essentially headed toward track 2 much more quickly than you were before your injury. And you've got this kind of loop that tends to occur where you much more quickly go into that anger response and you stay in it longer than you did probably pre-injury. Some other terms, it's anger and brain injury. That's anger is kind of a general term. Some of the other kinds of terms that we hear when we talk about emotions and brain injury are general alterations in mood. It doesn't necessarily always happen with anger. It can happen with sadness. It can happen with laughter. Not too long ago, we had a survivor who was a young woman, had a 3-year-old boy, and she had a very, very good outcome, returned home and returned to primary parenting responsibilities for this little boy. One of her challenges was she had some emotional dysregulation related to laughter. And when this 3-year-old boy would do 3-year-old boy kinds of things, naughty things, her first instinct was to laugh. Now, Blake does some things that are not okay, that my first instinct is to laugh, but I have a cortex that can stop me. I have my prefrontal lobes are relatively intact, and I can stop in that moment, recognize that if I laugh at what he's doing, I'm going to reinforce it, and the likelihood's going to go up that he's going to do this thing again. The survivor did not have access to that ability to shut off the laughter. So when this little guy would do kind of the naughty boy, 3-year-old kinds of things, her immediate response was to laugh, and she couldn't stop that the way most parents can. And it caused, just like I talked about, it caused that it was essentially reinforcing to this little boy. And now on down the line, there are lots and lots of parenting challenges related to this difficulty regulating emotion. We hear emotional lability. You tend to hear about that more with sadness than with anger. But, again, it's another term that we tend to talk about in brain injury. Low frustration tolerance, incredibly common, and that has to do with that trip, that switch being tripped a little bit more easily, more readily than it was pre-injury. General irritability, all the way up to aggression. When you have more severe types of brain injury, you can end up with some significant challenges related to physical aggression because of this dysregulation, the track 2, getting the train going down track 2 much more easily, and that self-perpetuating kind of characteristic of the limbic system working overtime as well. So why does this happen after brain injury? It can be, as we've talked about so far, kind of the direct result of the neuropathological changes after brain injury. The neurochemical changes, the reduction in access to the frontal lobes. It can have to do with difficulty adjusting. Brain injury is incredibly hard. Brain injury, nobody asked for this. Nobody wants this to happen. Brain injury reduces independence, and reduction in independence causes frustration, causes anger. It's a natural reaction. And so difficulty adjusting to the life changes, the life role changes after brain injury increases the propensity for anger and emotional discontrol to occur. The third is, we all have certain capacities to cope with the challenges in our life, whether we've had a brain injury or not. Some individuals tend to get angry more easily than others, whether they've had a brain injury or not. And when you combine somebody who maybe didn't have the most adaptive coping skills before they got hurt, and now you add some of the characteristics, some of the neuropathological changes that we've discussed so far, you end up with a much greater likelihood that anger, irritability, emotional discontrol is going to be even more maladaptive than it was before the injury. We all control our emotions. We control our interactions using our frontal lobes. We all have these coping skills. We all have this ability to adapt to the stress around us. And if we lose that ability, life gets much, much more difficult. And, finally, it's most likely a combination of all three. It's a combination of the neuropathological changes after the brain injury, the adjustment, and the difficulty with adjustment to the life roles that brain injury brings on, and as well as those pre-injury coping skills. So brain injury also causes some kind of unique issues that increase the likelihood for anger, increase the likelihood for emotional challenges. The first is that, when I think about how do I lower my own personal threshold, what kinds of situations do I tend to get angry in? The first one is when I'm tired. If I haven't gotten enough sleep, the kids tend to, and certain issues that come up tend to irritate me more if I haven't slept well, if I'm fatigued, if I'm tired. Well, fatigue is next to headache, is one of the top two symptoms, one of the top two challenges that survivors of brain injury talk about. The fog that I have a friend who's a survivor who talks about how as his day progresses, it's like a fog rolls in, and his thinking becomes cloudy, and his communication becomes cloudy, and his processing speed slows. And when you have that, when that's such a common symptom after brain injury, it obviously is going to increase the likelihood that emotional challenges are going to be present. Pain. Very often after brain injury, whether it's related to muscle tone, muscle spasticity, positional kinds of issues that the brain injury has caused, headaches. As pain goes up, the threshold for anger goes down. I'm more likely to get angry if I'm tired. I'm more likely to get angry if I'm in pain. And this is no different in our survivors, except that you see more pain and you see more fatigue. Overstimulation. When you get into environments where it's difficult to filter those distractions, one of the primary challenges for our survivors is that, you and I have the ability to, if I'm sitting in a room and talking with someone and there are people walking by outside the room, I have the capacity to select attention, right? I can ignore the individuals who are walking by outside the room. I can ignore the sound of the air conditioner kicking on and off. I can filter out those external distractions and concentrate on what I need to concentrate on. Survivors of brain injury often have significant difficulty with this. It's hard to filter out those external distractors. So you get somebody into a stimulating environment, they don't know what to attend to. That frustration and that likelihood for anger to occur goes up. Communication changes, very, very common after brain injury, to have difficulty finding words, difficulty processing language, taking longer to take in what's being said to them, and taking longer to process and produce language. When we work with little kiddos who don't have great, their language skills aren't fully developed, you tend to see, if I'm angry, I can't use my words, I am going to show you using my behavior. Now, that's an oversimplification. I'm not saying that survivors of brain injury are children, but some of the same rules apply. If I cannot communicate as efficiently verbally as I did pre-injury, it's going to be frustrating, and I'm going to be more likely to get frustrated, get angry, and have some of those kinds of challenges. Cognitive challenges. I know that one of my personal triggers for anger is, if we as a family get into the car and we're headed somewhere and somebody says they forgot something and we have to turn around and go back home, even if I'm halfway down the block and I have to turn around and go back home, it irritates me. It makes me angry. It's a known trigger for me. Now, if I now have a brain injury and am constantly having to go back and find things I've forgotten, go back and redo things, and constantly being, forgetting things, and forgetting things is one of my triggers, I'm going to tend to get angry much more often than I did pre-injury. All right. So let's talk a little bit I've talked a lot about why this is an issue. Let's talk a little bit about, so what do we do? How do we help? What kind of habits can we put in place? What kind of interventions can we put in place to help? We all have early warning signs. When we talk about, I'm going to talk here in a little bit about recognizing your signs of stress. There are little things that happen with our bodies. There are little things that happen with our emotions. There are little behaviors, little things that we do that are kind of those first signs that you're feeling stress or that you are moving toward anger. So helping the survivor identify those things. What are those concrete things that we can see that tell me, things maybe aren't moving the right, the train is on the wrong track, and we need to probably stop this process before we get into full-on anger. What are your triggers? What are those known triggers? I got Blake, that 12-year-old, he gets hangry. I know when he's grumpy that we need to get him often. If we get him something to eat, it's helpful. This is no different with survivors. Is hunger one of your triggers? Is fatigue one of your triggers? Do you have a plan when you're fatigued? Or whether you're fatigued or not, are you trying to push through and do more than your body is, if your body's sending you these signals that you need to stop, that you need to rest, that you need to take a few minutes or a half an hour and de-stress and move to a non-stimulating environment, if your body is telling you that you need to do those things, you need to listen to your body. Historically, if survivors have fatigue and they try to push through it, that risk for anger goes up. Pain. Staying in front of pain is incredibly important. When we talk about pain as a trigger for anger, Many survivors, again, you want to be strong, you want to push through, you want to wait till you're in pain to take the medications. And in many cases, you're fighting a losing battle if you're waiting for the pain before you're taking that pain med. Staying in front of the pain and not letting that pain get to a point where your threshold for anger decreases can be a really nice adaptive skill. Understanding how your pain cycles and getting in front of it with meds. And again, having that conversation with your physician as well can help reduce that risk. One of the first steps in addressing anger is and addressing any emotional kind of dysregulation is kind of back up to that top bullet. What are those early warning signs? And understanding that you've got to get in front of that we've got to back that train off the limbic system track and try to engage the cortex and start thinking about the situation versus just reacting to it with the limbic system. And that's a skill. It's a skill that we all learn, and some of us do it well and some of us do not do it well. And it's a skill that in many cases can be taught after brain injury. All right. One of the best, if I could write, if we have folks from different organizations out there listening who are challenged with this issue in the folks that you serve, there is actually a curriculum, a brain injury curriculum, and we've been doing this for a while at my place of work, and it's called Brain Injury Coping Skills, or BICS. BICS is it's about an 18 or 19 week course on brain injury, and it runs through, the first 5 sessions or so are all about how does the brain work, how does the healthy brain work, what happens when a brain is injured, what are some of the initial challenges after the brain is injured. And then the rest of the sessions focus on either specific challenges, whether they're initiation, inhibition, memory, depression. Some of the top challenges that you have after brain injury are addressed kind of in the middle section of the sessions. And then the last third are all basic stress management, basic emotional regulation sessions. Any of these, there is a session under this basic stress management techniques. There's an hour-long session that we do on recognizing the signs of stress. So what happens physically when you feel stress, what happens emotionally when you feel stress, what happens from a behavioral standpoint, what do you do when you start to feel stressed, having each survivor identify those things, and start to build some awareness of, how do I know when it's time to stop? How do I know when I need to separate myself from whatever situation I'm in? So how do I recognize what's happening within me in order to get in front of this issue? There's an entire hour-long session on relaxation and mindfulness. Mindfulness is essentially paying attention in the moment to what's happening, non-judgmentally. And this is hard. This is hard for me. This is the one session that I tend to be a relaxing by doing kind of guy. If I want to relax, I'm going to go for a run, or if I want to relax, I'm going to go to Northeast Iowa with a fly fishing rod and catch some trout. That's how I relax. I relax by doing. If I want to relax, I'm going to mow the lawn. This is a completely different kind of relaxation technique. And there's actually some decent evidence that suggests that if survivors can learn some of these basic deep breathing, relaxation, being present in the moment kind of strategies, that you can have an impact on emotional discontrol. And that's essentially because what's happening is if you stop yourself in the moment and use one of these relaxation techniques, you're increasing the likelihood that you can gain access to the cortex, to the thinking part of the brain, where you can work through this in a healthier, work through whatever's happening in a healthier kind of way. Reassuring thinking and effective problem solving. There are specific steps. There's an hour-long session on reassuring thinking. What kinds of thoughts do you have when you start to feel stress? Do you have alarming thoughts? Do you immediately think the negative? Do you immediately think the worst thing is going to happen? And then what happens with your thought process as you move down that train of thought toward alarming thoughts, or hot thoughts is the term that the BICS curriculum uses, versus how do I stop that and how do I move toward positive thinking? How do I, if this is a situation that I'm overreacting to, how do I stop that process, and how do I either dismiss it, which is often the case. You need to dismiss, we need to let it go, or how do I learn from it? And then there's effective problem solving. So there's an entire session that we go through and learn a problem solving, basic set of problem solving strategies, so that when you get into situations where you're having difficulty coming up with a solution for something that's causing you stress, you now have some specific steps that you can go through to address those things. Relating assertively is that's basic communication techniques. How do you become an active listener? How do you develop more healthy communication techniques in order to avoid those kind of misunderstandings that happen commonly after brain injury? So again, I would highly recommend, if you have folks with brain injury in your organization, if you're struggling with some of these kinds of issues, I would that brain injury, the BICS brain injury coping skills, is available. The manual is available through Lash and Associates. Sorry, that you can't read that at the bottom of the picture, but it is Lash and Associates that you get BICS through. Sleep hygiene is huge. Using those cognitive strategies. Remember, I talked about one of my triggers being memory challenge. If we're headed somewhere and I've forgotten something, it makes me angry. If you are a survivor who has these memory challenges and breakdowns in memory are a trigger for you, we want to make sure that we have some good, solid cognitive strategies for you to use so that we can decrease the incidence of triggers in your life. And then regular physician collaboration on meds. I, by background, am a speech-language pathologist. I'm not going to even begin to try to address medications. That's kind of beyond my scope of expertise. But for individuals who have significant anger, emotional discontrol, there are some medications that your physician may be able to prescribe that can help with that. Regularly having these kinds of conversations with your physician can be helpful. All right, caregivers. Talk a little bit about just some basic, take home, put in your pocket kind of strategies that you can use just in your everyday interactions with survivors to help reduce A, the amount, and B, the severity of some of the emotional discontrol issues that you may be having. First and foremost, we have natural human reactions to anger. When somebody's angry, we react. There's some kind of natural ways that we react to that. And usually we react by sending the experience down the track toward our limbic systems. And so for caregivers, I need you to access your cortex as well and use some strategies in these situations. The first one, are when somebody's angry, when somebody's worked up, our natural human reaction is to mirror what they are doing. If they get louder, we get louder. If they move more, we move more. If they stand up, we stand up. It's And that's the natural reaction. I need you to use your cortex and think about mirroring the kind of behavior that you want to see in the survivor. So when I'm working with a survivor who's agitated, who's angry, who's worked up, I tend to I want my eye level below theirs. I tend to make my voice quieter. I tend to move less. I tend to make myself smaller. I tend to talk in a more calm voice. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm trying to mirror the physical, what I want to see them do is what I'm trying to mirror versus my mirroring what they are doing. And again, it's really easy for me to say this stuff. You get into a situation and it's hard to do, but it does help. The next one is this is the direct result of a interaction that I saw that I've seen a number of times with survivors, and I work primarily with therapists, but you could translate this to a variety of professionals or caregiver types, where I had an individual, a survivor who had kind of come through a confused, agitated phase early in her recovery. And she was on the other side of that confused, agitated phase, but she still it didn't take much to send the train down the limbic system track. And one of the things that was a trigger for her was walking. So I had a physical therapist who knew that she needed to be working on walking with this survivor because the insurance company was pushing. We need this person served needs to be walking in order to justify ongoing care. We need to get this person up. We need to get them walking. So there was a certain amount of pressure on the therapist to get this individual more physically mobile. And the first thing that the therapist said was, "Hey, it's Joanne from physical therapy. Do you want to walk?" And of course, the survivor's response was no. And now that physical therapist was screwed because she knew she needed to get her to walk, and the survivor had said no. And she cajoled and begged, and finally got the survivor up, and they took a few steps. And of course, the survivor got angry or got agitated, and the session ended. And I pulled that physical therapist afterward, and I said, "Let's change one thing. I understand why you're asking whether you're wanting to engage her, you're wanting to give her choice. I get that. Let's do that in a way that doesn't make it so easy for her to say no. Rather than saying, 'Do you want to?' let's change it to, 'I need you to. Hey, it's Joanne from physical therapy. I need you to walk.' Or your family needs you to walk. Or the doctor needs you to." I use the doctor as the scapegoat all the time at work. The doctor needs you to do this. And it's not that survivor couldn't still say no. She could. It just wasn't the easy option. And from that point forward, those sessions got much better. So using those I need statements. Talking in the affirmative rather than the negative. Using terms like don't do it, you can't do this, stop that, no. When you use those kinds of terms, there's a basic human reaction to, there's many individuals that can be a trigger for, especially after brain injury. I think about at Lent, I had purchased a 6-pack of beer and turned to my wife and said, this stuff is getting very expensive. I should give up beer for Lent. And I was joking at the time, and my wife said, "You can't give up beer." And I gave up beer, not for any deep-seated spiritual reason, but just to prove that my wife can't tell me I can't do something. I gave it up for Lent. So that caused such a reaction in me, being told you can't. You think about survivors who in the course of their day get told you can't do this, you can't do that, don't do this. over and over and over again. And all you're doing is increasing, by using those terms, all you're doing is increasing the likelihood that that trigger or that switch is going to send their experience down the track to the limbic system. You're just priming the amygdala for that by using those terms. Talk about, the other example I use in here is if I tell you all right now not to think about pink elephants, I guarantee that every one of you just thought of a pink elephant. So we may be very well reinforcing the very things that we want our survivors to not do by telling them not to do it. If that makes sense. So you got to flip it. You got to think about what you want that survivor to do and talk about the things that you want them to do versus telling them all of the things that they can't do. All right. Remember, when that train has gone down the track toward the limbic system, in most cases, the cortex, that survivor does not have access to the cortex in that moment. So what does that mean? Well, it means that if your strategy for trying to reduce the survivor's anger is to rationalize, reason, problem solve, try to talk them through the situation, you're trying to access a part of that brain that survivor does not have access to. You've got to wait, in many cases, setting expectations, keeping them safe, backing off, letting things kind of calm down, getting through at least that 20-minute period where those hormones and neurotransmitters are kind of leaving the system and that survivor is returning to baseline. Waiting till that point, you need to wait till that point before you can try to access the cortex, before you can try to do that reasoning, rationalizing kind of stuff. So what tends to happen, what I tend to see is survivor gets ramped up, they start to get angry, and then the caregiver tries to reason and rationalize, and all that serves to do is ramp that survivor up even more. So again, keeping them safe, setting expectations, waiting for that wave of anger to pass and letting it drain from letting those chemicals drain from their system, and then doing the reasoning and rationalizing is a much more effective way to address it. All right. Kind of the last little section of the presentation here. And these are not my words. I don't want to lay claim to these as being my ideas because they are not. Just a little short story. About a year ago, I was asked by the HR department at my workplace to do the presentation, the annual in-service on professionalism. And because I know nothing about professionalism, I got on. I went to the library and I checked out a couple of books, and I happened to check out two by an author named Simon Sinek. Simon he's an anthropologist, he's a professional speaker, he's an author, he's a leadership trainer. His first book is called Start With Why, and that's all about aligning your personal why. Why do you do what you do with your organization's personal why? Why does your organization exist? And if your personal why aligns itself with your organization's reason for existence, you tend to get much more satisfaction out of your work. So that's Start With Why. The second book is called Leaders Eat Last. And in Leaders Eat Last, Simon kind of outlines the life is good neurotransmitters from a cultural anthropological standpoint. We've got essentially there are four basic neurotransmitters that result in this feeling is generic, what we could generically call a feeling of happiness. And so this is kind of the second step here. It's not just about stopping the anger. It's about, what habits can you pick up in your life? What processes can you put in place in order to replace the negativity with something a little bit more positive, something a little bit more healthy. And so in reading this stuff, I was, again, my original purpose was I need to do this for a professionalism in service, but it translated so well to the kinds of things that you do in high quality rehabilitation with survivors of brain injury to kind of remind them that they're human. These are basic human, these are your basic human feelings. Getting back to that sense that life is good. It kind of stops that process of thinking of yourself as a victim and reminds survivors that there are ways that I can feel better. So let's get through these. We got about 10 minutes. I'm going to kind of rush through them, and hopefully they'll make a little bit of sense to you. The first one, E, EDSO, as you can see, is the acronym. Endorphins are pain blockers. E stands for endorphins, one of the neurotransmitters that you get primarily from physical activity. So, okay, sorry, we're looking at questions. So endorphins, when I go for a run in the morning, when I get home from my run, I'm sweaty and I'm smelly and I feel really, really good. And just a little bit of an idea how powerful a pain blocker endorphins are. Last September, actually tore the insertion of my Achilles tendon into my heel bone. And I did it, I was running 7 miles that day, and I did it at mile 3.5. And I felt it, but it didn't bother me enough that I thought I needed to stop or walk, and ended up actually running 3.5 miles on a torn Achilles tendon. Now, when I got home and the endorphins left, I couldn't bear weight. So incredibly, incredibly powerful pain blocker. We also know that endorphins, sorry, I'm trying to switch slides. There it is. Endorphins modulate our appetite. Endorphins enhance our immune response. You're healthier if you are physically active. We know that if you have high levels of physical activity, you actually increase BDNF, which is a neurotrophic factor. It actually results in new growth of nerve cells and the components of nerve cells in the brain. And the more we understand about exercise, regular physical activity, the more we understand that, especially in the elderly population, that it is a key, if not the key ingredient in preventing cognitive decline. It's been proven more than any other factor as a key ingredient in reducing cognitive decline as we age. So first and foremost, how do we get that survivor active? How do we get them to move? If they can't run, that's fine. Can we get them on a recumbent bike? Can we get them to the gym and get them on a piece of equipment of some kind? Can we regularly incorporate physical exercise into their daily routine? They will feel better if we can do that. Are we regularly laughing with them? One of the stories that Simon Sinek tells is that, laughter actually produces endorphins. And when you laugh hard enough that you're saying, stop, it hurts, that's because the endorphins, you've kind of run through the endorphins. It's incredibly important to not only maintain a sense of humor, but laugh with our survivors. It's chemically good for us. Second one is dopamine. Dopamine's our goal reacher. And the top right picture of the watch is the little gray bar underneath the time is actually it's an activity bar, and that was my first activity watch. And when I would go to walk down the hallway, little bubbles, that bar is black at the beginning of the day, and the more activity you do, these little gray bubbles float across. So I was constantly walking around work looking at my watch. It's because I like the dopamine. I like that feedback. I like feeling like I'm reaching my goals. Any of you who are list makers, you know how good it feels to cross something off your list. Um, I was at Menards not long ago. I had a shopping list. I saw something that I needed. I put it in the cart. It wasn't on my list, so I wrote it on the list and crossed it off. I wanted the dopamine. It feels really good. Now, there's a downside to dopamine. You get dopamine from gambling. You get dopamine from alcohol. You get dopamine from your cell phone. If you think about what you do with your cell phone, you're constantly flipping through Facebook. You're constantly flipping through emails, looking for the good one. It's no different. You're using the same part of your brain that you use when you pull that or hit the button or pull the lever on the slot machine. So you've got to be, dopamine is highly, highly, highly addictive. So we want to use it in the right ways for our survivors. And it's all about goals. It's about setting goals. It's about understanding where you are. It's about understanding how you've progressed. It's about understanding how far you've come. It's about getting constant feedback about progress, whether you're a year post, a month post, or 10 years post. We need to be setting goals. We need to be, and they need to be visible. They need to be written. Our survivors need to understand what they're working toward and understand that they're progressing, that they're moving in the right direction. Understanding that they're succeeding. That's what dopamine's about. Serotonin is all about self-confidence, all about status. It's about getting better. It's about growing. Survivors, some of the best support groups that I facilitated in that 10 years, actually the primary drivers in those were the survivors. The survivors who, that in a support group, it's a natural environment for the survivor to be the expert. This is about learning. This is about growing. This is about achieving. How do we put them in situations where they're getting better, where they're becoming more? Are we giving public recognition? The reason why we do graduation, one of the reasons why we do graduation ceremonies is you get up, you walk across that stage, you take your diploma, and you get a surge of self-confidence. It feels good. Are we doing those things for our survivors? And what kinds of activities can we put in place in their daily activities in order to access that serotonin, that sense that they're getting better, that they're achieving more, that we're climbing the ladder? The last one is oxytocin. It's all about love and relationships. It's about bonds. It's about giving of your time and energy. I was at Come and Go the other day, and I put my big gulp on the counter, and the lady next to me paid for it. I didn't know her, but she got a surge of oxytocin. I got a surge of oxytocin. The guy behind the counter got a surge of oxytocin. And my first thought, I had my $1.58 ready to pay for my big gulp. And my first thought was not, sweet, I got an extra $1.58 for the day. It was, all right, here you go. I'll pay for whoever the next person is that comes through with a big gulp. Oxytocin is the neurotransmitter that pays it forward. All right, we're running low on time. I'm going to quickly talk about kind of how do you put this all together. And I'm going to do that by talking about a survivor. Every once in a while I get to jump in if I've got a speech pathologist that's sick, or if we're double booked, I get to jump in on sessions and work with survivors. And I get a lot of enjoyment out of it. I get a lot of oxytocin out of it. It's one of the reasons I went into therapy in the first place. But I stepped into a session with a 55-year-old woman. Her name was Mary, and Mary was a year post TBI. She was being seen by speech pathology for some ongoing cognitive challenges. She had lost her job after a brain injury. She had a husband who he had alcoholism. She had a significant weight gain after her injury, and she primarily spent her days watching TV. And Mary it was not a good day for Mary when I stepped in. And I tried to start with the basic cognitive stuff that they'd been working on in speech, and I could tell Mary wasn't in it. And I said, Mary, what goal can we set? What would you like to achieve in the next 45 minutes? If at the end of this session you could say, I achieved this, it would make it a good session. And Mary's response was, I just want to be happy. And my first thought was, crap. Okay, how do I do that as a speech pathologist? But this all happened at about the time I was reading this Leaders Eat Last book. And so Mary, first and foremost, we set some goals. Mary used to love to walk. So she set a goal she was going to walk a mile a day for the next week. It wasn't something she had done. She had the physical capacity to, she just hadn't done it since she'd gotten hurt. The second one was she was going to start to attend a Alcoholics Anonymous to be with other people who were going through what she was going through. And the third one was that she was going to do something good for somebody. Mary had been one of the job that she had lost was actually in the cooking. She worked as a cook, and she indicated that she had a new neighbor, and that she could use those skills, those cooking skills, to bake a pie for that new neighbor. So those were the basic goals that we set. And at the end of that session, we'd addressed endorphins. So Mary was going to be walking on a regular basis. We'd address dopamine. We'd set some very concrete visual goals that Mary was going to achieve. And we'd address serotonin. She was going to go to that AA meeting and work with other wives of alcoholics, and endorphins, oxytocin. She was going to do something good for somebody else. And at the end of that session, she was happy. Now, was that a traditional speech therapy session? No, but it met Mary where she was, and it addressed the things that needed to be addressed. And when I saw Mary a week later, life was moving in a better direction. Was it perfect? Absolutely not, but it was better. So at the end of the day, we want our survivors to be their own inspiration. We want them to be their own solution. We want them to have their own motivation. And it's a combination of getting in front of that anger, that skill set, as well as developing some new habits in life to move them that way. That's all I have. Thank you guys for listening.
Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and do some questions. So we're going to check and see what questions have dropped in during the session. And while I'm speaking, feel free to go ahead and enter your questions if you haven't already. And while you're doing that, please remember to reach out to the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa and our Neuro Resource Facilitation Program if you are looking for more resources or information on brain injury, and we can help connect you to information, webinars, things that you might be looking for. Okay, so we'll just kind of see what questions are here. Someone was wondering if they could get the link for the Lash & Associates, and we can go ahead and email that out after the session. We'll be sure to get that sent to you guys, so that's no problem. And then, let's see. Someone said they missed how to get involved in the 19-week course. I'll have Dave kind of explain that again.
So the 19-week course that's actually our BICS course, and we do that at On With Life. I do that every Tuesday evening from 5:30 to 6:30 for all of our inpatient and outpatient persons served and families. So if you're an On With Life survivor, that would be something that would be available to you. If you are an individual who is in an organization, a different organization, my step one would be go ahead and order that BICS curriculum through Lash & Associates, and again they'll email out that. If you'd like a copy of the worksheets from that, you can feel free to shoot me a note, and I will send a packet of worksheets out to you if that's something you're interested in.
Okay, let's see if we have any other. I think that is all for now, so we will go ahead and end the session. And I want to thank everybody again for participating today. And your email, you will get an email with your certificate of attendance along with a link to a survey that you can complete with your feedback on today's webinar. So please feel free to do that as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts or any other ideas that you might have for future webinars. And then thank you again to Dave for being here today. So thank you all, and I hope that you have a good rest of your day.